Hello. Oh gosh, show me the participants window. Okay. All right, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. Do you hear a horrible, loud, like mechanical growling noise outside or?
No, just you.
Okay, good, because I don't know what they're doing outside, but it's making a really horrible, loud noise. It's been going for like at least 2 hours. It's driving me crazy, but I'm glad that you can't hear it. That's important. I do wish it would stop, though. It's kind of distracting for me. How are you all doing?
Good, sir.
Good. How are you doing, Professor?
Doing all right. I'm, on the one hand, looking forward to the 3-day weekend. On the other hand, it's supposed to be 115 degrees on Saturday. So,
Is this getting cool too?
yeah, I mean, this is the hottest time of year. Oh man, another class right before this. Yeah, I definitely feel glad that my teaching schedule is such that I don't have to lecture more than one time per day. But I mean, Zoom is exhausting. I don't know about you, but just being this attentive to a camera, but not being in a room with other people is very tiring for me. I don't know.
True.
Arnav, were you able to get did the other assignments unlock for you okay?
Yeah, I completed the assignments right after our class ended in the last session.
Awesome.
So yeah, so it was cool. Like
Awesome.
it was fine.
Glad to hear.
The class 7.
Okay, so it is 2. I guess people are starting to trickle in. So today we're going to start talking about plate tectonics. And so that's going to be the topic of our next 2 lectures. So today and next Wednesday, because do not forget Monday is a holiday. So we do not have class Monday, nothing is due Monday. So there will be a quick quiz based on the stuff we talk about today, but that isn't going to be due until a week from today. So again, like all the others, this one's 2 questions, so 3 minutes of your time. Because plate tectonics is a 2-lecture topic, there is not going to be another vocabulary thing for next Wednesday. So for everything that is a multiple lecture topic, there's only going to be 1 vocabulary matching. So you aren't going to have one of those every time. You're not missing anything. So the next one of those we'll have is due the following Monday, so a week from this coming Monday, and so that'll go up right after next Wednesday's class. But yeah, plate tectonics is 2 lectures, then minerals is going to be 2 lectures, and then we're going to have our first of 4 tests. And like I said on the syllabus, They're multiple choice tests. The way it's going to happen is we will start the class by having like a 20-minute review session. So you can ask whatever you want to ask and go back over. And then once we hit to 25, I'll cut off the review session and you can start, and then you'll have from 2:30 to 3:15 to do the test. It'll be about 30 questions, kind of similar in tone to the quick quizzes. So that's coming up in a couple weeks. Just don't forget about it. But I'll remind you too. I'm not going to be like, surprise, we have a test, but I'll keep you posted. But yeah, hopefully you all did the quick quiz that was due right before this class and the plate tectonics vocabulary matching, because we're going to dive right in. So the way we're going to divide talking about plate tectonics is today we're going to talk about sort of what it is and how it was figured out, because I think it's one of the coolest pieces of detective work in all of earth science. I mean, I've been trying to emphasize in general that there's kind of a lot of detective work and storytelling involved, like using scientific evidence to put together a story of what has to have happened. And that's what we're going to be talking about, that kind of throughout the semester. But in my mind, how they figured out that plate tectonics is a thing is just, it's a really amazing story from a lot of pieces of evidence from a lot of different places and a lot of different scientists coming together over several decades to figure out this is how the Earth works. This is how the physics of the Earth makes things move and change. So we're gonna mostly tell that story today, and then next Wednesday we're gonna get into really how it all works. So I'm gonna start though. So when I say the word theory, what do you think that means? What is a scientific theory?
Like an assumption of something?
Yeah, so how many of you think like that the idea that it's an assumption or a concept worth testing?
It's the facts, the facts of the Earth.
So it's sort of somewhere between those, because you're using theory as a way to. Well, let me step back a second. So that idea that it's an assumption worth testing is super, super common. That is, like if you ever watch a movie or a TV show or read a book about, like a fictional book about scientists, they're going to be like, ah, yes, I have a theory, and it's this, and we're going to test it. And that's not actually what a theory is in the context of science. So a lot of those pieces of fiction lead you astray. So usually the way that fiction talks about theories, I have a hunch, it's a hypothesis. It's more like, here is a concept or a question that I wish to test with an experiment. But a theory, as Arnav mentioned, is a lot more robust. A theory is maybe one step short of saying this is definitely 100% absolutely provable fact, but it's really, really darn close. So in terms of science and in terms of not just this class, not just earth science, but like every science, so this is actually the definition in your book. But a theory is a scientific idea that is supported by an abundance of evidence, that has passed many tests and failed none. So basically what that means is, like, every piece of evidence you can find, every piece of data, every observation, everything that you see and record and notice, everything that you get out of an experiment says, yeah, this is what's going on. And the many tests that it mentions is, again, experiments, sort of ways of, thinking about things through that framework, stepping back and going, okay, does this work in this situation or this situation or this situation? Does it make sense with that observation or this data? And so the answer is yes, then it passes all of the tests. And if there are any cases where it just can't explain it, where it fails, then it can't be a theory, because you still have a question. You still have a, like, why doesn't this part work? So a theory is really, really, really darn close to being absolute fact. So the reason you can't say it's like 100% definitely absolute fact is that it's often really hard to make those observations. We can't literally look inside the Earth. And as we were talking about in the first week of class, geologic time is really long. A lot of these processes take millions or billions of years, and we can't see that. Not even scientists, but humans have not been around long enough to directly observe that. And so a theory is basically the strongest statement you can have without having like literally seen the whole thing happen over multiple cycles. So something that we have seen, so like gravity, that's a law. We can see things fall, we can see things pull towards each other. Like gravity is an observational fact, but also gravity can work really, really fast. But for the most part in earth science, just because time is so long and a lot of these things move so slowly, pretty much the strongest thing you're gonna get is a theory. And so plate tectonics is a theory, but everything points to plate tectonics. And today we're gonna get at what everything is that points to it. So does that make sense? Any questions about that? Oh gosh, that noise outside just got louder. Anyway, if at any point you cannot hear me, tell me. For those of you who came in, there's a very loud noise outside my apartment and it got louder. So let me know if you can't hear me. But anyway, so that's a theory. And so for plate tectonics, we'll actually pretend you didn't see that slide yet. What is plate tectonics? Do any of you have pre-existing knowledge of what that is? Or at least what you think it is.
Isn't it about the plates and how like they move? Like,
Yeah. Yeah, so on the most basic level, there are plates and they move. And that really is the most basic level. So, of course, there's a lot of details about how they move, why they move, what happens when they move toward each other or away from each other. But yeah, that basic level, there are plates and they move. If you're going to use some of the more technical terms that we introduced last lecture, the plates are part of the lithosphere. So we're talking about that mechanical or physical layering of the Earth. And so the lithosphere is that hard, brittle, breakable rock. And so plate tectonics says that the lithosphere is broken up into discrete, rigid plates, and they move around and interact. So they're discrete in that each plate is its own unit with clear edges and boundaries. They're rigid in that they snap rather than flowing, and they move around and interact. And so we know that lithosphere, so new rock forms at the middle of the ocean, and it dies at the edges of the continents. And the positions of both continents and oceans change as the plates move. And so, you know, what is it? There are plates and they move. Why and how are sort of this stuff. So today we're going to mostly be talking about the what and the how we know. How they move a little bit today, more next time. And definitely the interactions at the edges of the plates are intense and violent. So if you're living in the middle of a plate, you're probably not going to have a lot of geology-related hazard. Like, let's say you think about like Minnesota is the middle of the plate is the middle of the plate that most of North America is on. And Minnesota doesn't have volcanoes. Minnesota doesn't have earthquakes. Don't have much in the way of landslides. They have blizzards. They have tornadoes. But those are weather, not geology. So it's really the edges of the plates, and California is absolutely the edge of the plate. That's where you have violent collisions and interactions. It's where you get your volcanoes and your earthquakes, where you get your really big mountains. So yeah, that's the basic theory. And again, I'd like you to be familiar with all of these parts of it. It's on the bullet points and notes that I posted before class. But yeah, there's a lot of parts to this. And but kind of one of the nice things about it is you can boil it down to that statement of there are plates and they move around. It's kind of a beautifully simple statement. And honestly, most theories, most things that are really robust and really answer like all of the questions you can throw at them end up being simple. Because in general, if the simpler the explanation, kind of the better it is. Sometimes you need a complicated explanation, but if you can step back and go, rather than this extremely complicated sequence of events, what if it's just, hey, the plates are moving? It's beautifully simple, and it works for explaining pretty much everything we see on Earth. But how did we get there? This is kind of a long story. And so again, most of today is really going to be a detective story of collecting a lot of different kinds of evidence from different parts of the earth and different categories of geology. Some geophysics, some geochemistry, some paleontology, some just people looking around and going, those rocks have the same stripes on them as these other rocks. It took all of earth science to come together and go, this is really what's going on. And so we're going to go through that today. Well, let's start with something that, let's just start with the shapes of the continents. What are some things you might notice about these shapes?
It looks like a messed up puzzle.
Yeah, so a puzzle is a really good way to put it. It absolutely is a puzzle, and in some places it can get super messed up, super crazy collision land, for example, or things ripping apart. Yeah, so a puzzle is an excellent way to put it. You actually kind of precognition to my next slide. We'll get there. But what are some specific things that you see about these shapes, about these puzzle pieces?
Africa looks like slides into where North America and South America would be.
Yeah, so that is actually where this whole thing started. Not where plate tectonics started, but where the idea of plate tectonics started. So how many of you have noticed that the coast of Eastern South America and the coast of Western Africa look like they fit together like puzzle pieces? If you haven't ever looked at it before, just definitely, look at that now. This point kind of fits right in here. And you also correctly observed that actually sort of northwestern coast of Africa kind of plugs into the east coast of North America. So Florida would fit in here. The Carolinas and Virginia kind of go into here. But there's an ocean in there now, right? Like, what's the deal? How do these things fit together or look like they should, but they're thousands of miles apart? And actually, that's not the only place. Like you might notice, Madagascar looks like it should plug into Africa right here. Or if you look at the Red Sea in here, this side of the coast is the exact same shape as the other side of the coast, but there's water. Or even some smaller details, like how Spain and France, actually, if you line these edges up, should fit together, but now they're separate. There's a whole lot of things like that. The closer you look, the more you find things that fit together. But imagine now you're looking at some maps of the world. Imagine you're looking at maps in like the 1800s or even the 1700s. The first person to actually publish an article saying, hey, doesn't it look like the continents used to fit together, was at the end of the 1800s. But people have kind of been looking at this and going, for a lot longer than that. Especially because the human brain loves to find patterns. Just as humans, we're sort of qualified, well, not qualified, but we inherently look for patterns in things. We like to see patterns even where, sometimes it's dangerous. Sometimes we see patterns where there aren't. But in this case, just noticing things that seem like they should go together is part of how the human brain works. And so people have been noticing this detail as long as maps have existed. But the question is, how is this when there's oceans? What makes this work? And especially to go back to that really good puzzle analogy, there are a lot of ways you can put together puzzles. Sometimes you can sometimes things have shapes that fit together shape-wise, but then make a picture that doesn't make any sense at all. Like what's going on here. There are a whole lot of these weird mismatched puzzles that you can find. But in this case, is this a case where the shapes look like they fit, but really it's a horse and a train and it doesn't make any sense at all? Or are they indeed pieces of the same puzzle that are just spread out in a way and you have to wonder what pushed them to other sides of the table? So spoiler alert, with plate tectonics, it actually turned out to be pieces of the same thing. And it wasn't like matching a horse with a train at all. But this is kind of where you go from the hypothesis. At this stage, doesn't it look like the continents used to fit together? It was very much a hypothesis. And so in order to turn it into a theory, people needed to find evidence and put it all together to show, no, this is the same picture. This does all go into the same puzzle. So does that make sense? What we're going to do is we're going to go through all of the steps, all the pieces of the puzzle. If it lets me advance my slide. So the idea of plate tectonics kind of started with the idea of continental drift. So have you heard this before? Is this a familiar term?
Yes.
I see people nodding. Yeah. So continental drift is
Yes.
exactly. Yeah. Question? Or just agreement? Okay, I see some thumbs up.
No.
Yeah, so continental drift is exactly what it says on the box. And a lot of geology terms are really, really literal. So continental drift says the continents drift. They move. They have not always been in the position that they are now. This basically, and so this, on the one hand, knowing what we know now in the year 2020, this kind of seems obvious, but imagine it's 1890 or 1900, and you're kind of going, whoa, okay, so yeah, they look like they fit together. What if they actually were? And the fact that they don't fit together now means that they moved. And so that was kind of the first step, was articulating, with scientists saying, yes, they moved. They have to have moved. But that's the first step. That just proposes this is a what happened, not a how did it happen? Why did it happen? But another thing that a lot of humans are unfortunately, an unfortunate part of the human psyche is a lot of us are resistant to change. A lot of people are very adamantly against having their ideas challenged, as we kind of see in politics today, unfortunately. A lot of people tend to stick back to sort of being conservative in thought about, like, this is what I've always known, so I need to be convinced to change what I know. A lot of people have a harder time with going, okay, this is brand new, I'm automatically going to go with it. And so trying to convince people to abandon this viewpoint of, this is the way I've known things, so this is the way it must be, requires collecting a lot of evidence. So if you're in an existence of, like, the Earth is the center of the universe and things just are the way they are because that's where they've been, even this sounds like a really big challenge. And so it was up to scientists to find observations that support the idea that the continents moved. A lot more than just puzzle pieces that happen to be the same shape. We want to show that it is the same picture. And as it turns out, they didn't have to look super hard. There are actually a whole lot of things other than the shapes of the coastlines that match up. So first of all, if you put the coastlines back together, you get this idea of Pangea. So have you sort of thumbs up or hands raised or whatever, have you heard of Pangea before? Or sometimes it's Pangaea. Sometimes it might be spelled like that way I just put it. So Pangea is a supercontinent. It's where all the continents are glommed together. And also the ocean at this time was called Panthalassa. So Gaia is Earth, Thalassa is ocean. So Pangea is all the continents and Panthalassa is all the oceans. And so basically, if you just rewind things and stick coastlines back together in a way that makes sense, you get something that looks like this. But again, they had to, and so with this in mind, with people just sort of rewinding things and putting the coastlines back together, they were like, okay, so if this is real, if this isn't just a coincidence, we're gonna look for stuff that matches across these boundaries. We're gonna look for other things that are the same on the east coast of North America and the east coast of South America and the west coast of Africa. Things that are the same between northern North America and northern Europe. Things that match between India and Africa. And so on. And so they had a target for where to look for things. And so when they went to look, they found a whole lot of things. So the first thing is it's not just that the shapes match, it's the rocks that match. So it turned out that when they went and looked between South America and Africa, between North America and Africa, Greenland and Scandinavia, or Greenland and Norway, turns out that not just the shapes were the same, it was the same rocks. They found rocks that when they were able to do some absolute dating, but also just looking at the qualities of the rocks, the same chemistry, the same series of folds and breaks that show that they have to have formed in the same situation at the same time. Just identical rocks. So like if you were to take a sample of a rock from this part of South America and this part of Africa, you wouldn't be able to tell whether it came from South America or whether it came from Africa because they formed when they were together. Or similarly, if you're familiar with the Appalachian Mountain Belt along North America, it matches, like you can find exact shapes that match between North America and Africa, or exact shapes that go into Spain and into the UK. It just all lines up. And so it's the same rocks, the same shapes, the same age, the same rate of eroding after those mountains formed. It's just the exact same stuff. So not only do the shapes match, the pictures on either side match. So that was a good place to start. So if they'd found totally different rocks here from here, maybe they would have to step back and go, is this actually working? But nope, same rocks, step in the right direction. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Cool. So once they had that match, they were able to start looking for more stuff. So it turns out that there were a lot of matching what we call climate belts. So a climate belt is like, you know how when you're closer to the equator, it's kind of tropical. And as you get further from the equator, it's, you tend to get drier stuff that's colder. Generally that idea of like, your tropical paradise is near the equator and your barren tundra is near the poles. The North Pole is cold, the South Pole is cold, the equator is warm. And so under different weather conditions, under different climate conditions, different kind of stuff is going to form. The rocks that you're going to find on a tropical island are going to look very different from the rocks that you find in a desert or the rocks that you find in a place where there's a lot of ice. And similarly, the fossils that you're going to find are going to be really, really different. So like in equatorial places, you get a lot of swamps. In really dry places, you get a lot of salt deposits from things evaporating. In places that used to be coasts or are now, you're going to find like coral reef deposits, like remnants of old ones. And so basically when people put all of the continents back together in the configuration of Pangaea, it matched up as well. There's the stuff that, there's evidence that of tropical stuff in South America, North America, Africa, into parts of Europe and Asia, lining up into what used to be the equator at the time of Pangaea. And then similarly, you found matching glacier stuff, at stuff that used to be the South Pole, or matching sort of drier tundra at places that used to be closer to the North Pole during the time of Pangaea. So not only do the types of rocks match up, the kind of climates that you can tell from what's there match up. So that was another thing that, doesn't necessarily make sense to find tropical things in, say, upstate New York. But if you think about how upstate New York used to be attached to Western Africa, which used to be at the equator, suddenly it makes more sense. I hope. Does it make sense? Cool.
Yeah.
So now we got two pieces of evidence. We've got the rocks, and then kind of the, both the underlying rocks and then the overlying stuff that's determined by the climate. So cool, 2 steps. Let's keep looking. So I mentioned that there were places that had glaciers, like Antarctica, which still does, and southern South America, southern Africa, India, southern Australia. So glaciers, we're going to talk about a whole lot more when we talk about sedimentary rocks and landscape features. But glaciers, because they're huge blocks of ice that move. And because ice is rough and brittle, and also because it can pick up rocks and drag it, ice can actually make these grooves on other rocks. So here's an example of a rock that used to have a glacier on it. I think that, if I remember correctly, this is an example from California. But see how this rock has all of these lines in it, and see how they all point in the same direction? So what that means is that a glacier moved across this rock in the direction of those lines. And the ice itself and the small rocks that the ice picked up just scratched grooves into this other rock. and left behind evidence of the glacier, even though there is not ice here anymore. And so, so that's another thing you can look for. You can look for not only do the rocks match, but do the marks match? Can you find evidence of a glacier having been in these places at the same time and of the glaciers moving in the same direction? And so all of these places, southern South America, southern Africa, India, southern Australia, have glaciated rocks. They all have rocks that have these kind of marks in them, even though there, for the most part, aren't glaciers there anymore. There are still some in the Andes, but for the most part, like South Africa's not really that cold. You know, India is definitely not going to have glaciers anymore, except for up in the Himalaya. But there's evidence of glaciated rocks even in places that are now quite warm. And they kind of go in directions that don't make a whole lot of sense until you rewind plate tectonics, until you put the continents back together based on the shape of their coasts. And then you see a pattern of ice moving out from the pole. Then you see a pattern of ice started in Antarctica and moved outward over these things around it. And then you can also see some evidence of, of when the ice melted, it started moving back towards the pole. So you start to see this moving out and moving back in. That makes sense when you put it together, but doesn't necessarily make sense when they're apart. So now you've got the deeper rocks and you've got the surface rocks and you get the glacial marks that all say, yeah, this only makes sense when you stick it together. Sound good?
Yes, sir.
Wait, there's more. So Arnav, I hear you talking, but I can't actually hear the words you're saying.
Yes, sir. I just said yes.
Oh, okay. So that was someone talking in the background? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. So then let's move on. Yeah. So there's even more. So fossils, as it turns out, match too. Both land critters and sea critters. So people looking for fossils of plants even have found the same stuff in South America and in Africa, the same stuff in Africa and India. And these are places that are really far apart now. And so it doesn't make sense. Like, there are definitely kinds of things that are called convergent evolution, where things that are of different backgrounds, but living in similar conditions, can kind of evolve to being similar to each other. But in this case, they were finding literally exactly the same things. There was no evidence that they were different species, but these species are really far apart. And so for something like Mesosaurus, which is a sea creature, you could go, okay, yeah, maybe this thing is pretty big. Maybe it could swim from South America to Africa, I guess. But what about this guy? This guy, Syngnathus, is a land creature. He's got stubby little legs and a little bitty tail. He's not going to swim from Africa to South America. And also, there's these, plants are definitely not going to swim from continent to continent. This is not Swamp Thing, or this guy, maybe this isn't a reptile, Lystrosaurus, but he's, again, also stubby little legs. This guy is not going to be a good swimmer. So the fact that this exists on all of the southern continents, it makes a lot, you could go, maybe this guy somehow swam with his stubby little legs. But if you think about all of the other evidence that says these continents were stuck together, then both of these stubby little leg guys could have just walked between South America, Africa, Antarctica, Australia, India. They could have just walked, probably pretty slowly, because their legs are small, but the continents are moving even more slowly. So this is the kind of thing where, yeah, you could come up with multiple explanations. Maybe there was a glacier there and a glacier there that happened to move in the same way. Maybe this animal swam from here to here and this plant swam from here to here. But it starts to make a lot more sense to go, well, if the continents were stuck together, it makes all this easier because everything was literally in the same place. One thing happening in the same place makes a lot more sense than the same thing happening in a lot of very different places. So simplest possible explanation works better. Cool. So, whoops. So with all of these things, with the fossils, with the rocks, with the shapes of the coastlines, with the glacial striations, that was generally enough to convince people that, yeah, okay, the continents probably moved. They moved. Continental drift is real. But all that says is that they moved, that it did happen. But the reason it doesn't become a theory yet is because it doesn't say anything about why. It doesn't get into the mechanism of how this happened at all. It just says that it did. So the next question towards, really driving the point home that this works is figuring out how it has to have happened. So again, taking South America and Africa, what is between South America and Africa?
The Atlantic Ocean.
Yeah, the Atlantic Ocean. There's a heck of a lot of water. How did it get there? Yeah, so that was kind of the next question. Yeah.
Melting of ice.
The what, sorry?
Melting of ice.
So in this case, it was not the melting of ice, but that's definitely something people thought about. There were a whole lot of reasons people thought about for going, how is there water here? How did water push these continents apart? Because, if the ocean had if ice just melted and flooded things, flooded over Pangaea, you wouldn't necessarily see these nice clean breaks that line up with each other. So something has to have moved them rather than just flooding them. And since there's an ocean in there, the question becomes, how did that ocean get there? How did that ocean get there and push things apart? Because the ocean has to have pushed them apart, right? Does that make sense? That how it has to have, the ocean has to have opened up rather than just spilling over? If it doesn't make sense yet, hopefully it will with the next few slides. So yeah, people were like, yeah, this ocean has to have moved it. The ocean opened up and pushed these apart. How did that happen? So that idea is called seafloor spreading. That idea that the ocean opened up is called seafloor spreading. Have any of you heard that term before? So I see some no's and some yeses. More no's than yeses.
No.
A very resounding no. So we actually use this term less now because it's kind of a concept that predates plate tectonics. So plate tectonics explains this. But seafloor spreading is also exactly what it sounds like. It says that the ocean is spreading, or more importantly, the bottom of the ocean is spreading and water is going into that space. So seafloor spreading says, yeah, the continents that used to match up now have oceans between them. Therefore, the oceans have to have formed between the continents, because if it formed over the continents, they wouldn't necessarily match. But because they match exactly and the shape of the ocean follows the shape of those coastlines, the ocean has to have formed. And so if an ocean is forming, it has to be pushing those things apart. Because again, if it wasn't pushing them apart, they'd be still next to each other. So seafloor spreading says that the ocean opening up pushes the continents apart. Which, how does that happen, right? How does the ocean push the continents? I know I've said that water is extremely powerful, and it is, but this is actually beyond just the force of water. The depth of the ocean, even the deepest part of the ocean is still like teeny weeny compared to the thickness of tectonic plates and compared to the thickness of the entire Earth. So in this case, it is the bottom of the ocean that is doing the work. And the bottom of the ocean is made of rock. The water is just filling in the space that the rock is making. But how did people come to this conclusion? How did people realize that the bottom of the ocean is moving and changing and spreading? I mean, well, first of all, if the continents are moving and they're not in the same place that they used to be in, the oceans therefore can't be in the same place that they used to be in because the continents are somewhere different. So the oceans have to be moving too. And it turns out that the mechanism for how the ocean moves matters a lot for how the continents move. So seafloor spreading happens at these things called mid-ocean ridges. And so these which are exactly what they sound like. They're a ridge that is in the middle of the ocean. And people discovered these actually mostly during the World Wars, especially during World War II, when there started being submarines that were, people did not want to attack them. And so by looking for submarines, or even just looking for, getting a sense of the ocean in general, but especially by trying to detect submarines moving around in the ocean, they started to learn a lot more about what the shape of the ocean floor looks like. And it turns out they found these things called mid-ocean ridges, which are these long features that are sometimes up to 2 kilometers, or up to about a 1.5 miles high, that run through the middle of the ocean. And they tended to follow the shapes of the coastlines. And so if you look at this mid-ocean ridge, this is called the Mid-Atlantic Ridge because it's in the middle of the Atlantic. It's smack in the middle of the Atlantic. Look at the shape of this. See this curve? And look at the shape of the coast of Africa. Now look at the shape of the Caribbean and Florida. This same curve exists both in the middle of the ocean and on the edges of the continents. And this actually goes, I'll show you another picture with more of them on the next slide, because this is true for all of them, for every ocean, for every gap in a place where continents look like they used to fit together. There is one of these. And so it kind of starts to suggest that maybe this crack in the middle of the ocean started as the crack between the continents. And as it got wider and wider and wider, the ocean floor started to form and push the continents away. Because another thing people realized actually when they were looking at these mid-ocean ridges is they're not just cracks, they're actually volcanoes. These are long, long rows of very, very quiet volcanoes actually. They don't really explode that much, they just kind of leak. And so they realized that, yeah, these things leak new rock. And so maybe when the continents first started to crack apart, they were leaking new rock, and that new rock started pushing the continents away, which was leaking new rock and pushing and pushing and pushing. It's kind of like a conveyor belt. It's the new stuff pushes the old stuff out of the way. Rather than, so if it weren't pushing, it would be piling up, and you would have tons and tons and tons of really steep mountains right on the edges of all the continents. But we don't. Like the east coast of the US is definitely not big piles of volcanic rock, not at all. Because all of that rock is going onto the ocean floor and pushing it away. Does that make sense? Like again, imagine a conveyor belt of like stuff comes out of the mid-ocean ridge and pushes out and piles up, and comes out and pushes out and piles up. And so when people actually went and looked at the age of the rocks around all of the mid-ocean ridges around the entire world, they actually realized that the youngest rocks are closest to the ridges and the oldest rocks are further away. And so they were able to figure out the age of these rocks a couple of ways. Some of it is, again, you can take absolute age. You can do some chemistry to figure out exactly how old a rock is. But a nice thing about this being volcanic rock is that one way you can tell how old it is by how hot it is. Because if it just came out of that volcano, it's going to be a lot warmer than if it came out of that volcano millions of years ago, right? And so a lot of this is actually temperature based. And so again, our continents are in gray and our oceans are multicolored, right? And so the mid-ocean ridges are these black lines. So first, let's look at the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, because it really is smack dab in the middle of the Atlantic. The shape of this ridge exactly follows the shape of the coast of the Americas and the shape of the coast of Africa and Western Europe. It's really, I mean, you can all see that shape, right? It's just, when you look at it, you go, of course. But then when people figured out the age, they're like, yeah, this stuff next to it is really young and really warm. And as you get further away, it gets older and colder. So the oldest rocks in the Atlantic are right on the coast of North America and the coast of Africa. And the youngest rocks are along the ridge. So what that says is, yeah, this crack formed, and this rock came out first, And then more rock came and pushed it out of the way, and more rock came out and pushed it out of the way, and so on and so on. And it's still going. The Pacific is a little bit more complicated, but you can still see this is called the East Pacific Rise. And the reason it's not in the middle is because things are, because the North America is moving at a different speed than Asia, as it turns out. But you can still see how along the East Pacific Rise, the stuff that's closer to it is red, is hot, is young. And the stuff that's further from it is blue, is cold, is old. You notice some weird stuff like there's East Asia and Southeast Asia are, from a tectonic standpoint, incredibly messy. So you see lots of different colors around here. But just looking at the major oceans, again, looking at the Indian Ocean, right? India used to be attached to Africa. And you can see that this is new, and this is older, and this is older. Madagascar tried to separate from Africa a pretty long time ago and stopped. So there's kind of an old ridge. You can also kind of get a sense of how fast these things are moving. Because in the Atlantic, you see how this band of red is kind of narrow compared to how in the Pacific it's really wide. So basically the Atlantic is spreading slower because its stuff is pooling up more slowly and pushing things out of the way more slowly. Whereas the Pacific is moving a lot faster. So the rate that these things are pushing away before they cool down is way faster. So that would explain if this is spreading faster, that's why the Pacific is wider. If this is spreading slower, that's why the Atlantic is narrower. Does that make sense? So yeah, every ocean has a thousands of miles long crack that is a volcano running down the middle of it. And in some cases it goes up on land, like Iceland is weird, but we'll talk about Iceland next time. But yeah, so people were going, yeah, this is a nice symmetrical, it's very symmetrical. And so while you could, try to come up with some really convoluted story about why it's symmetrical, isn't it a lot easier to just say it used to be stuck together and was moving apart at the same rate? Yeah. This is another case where the simplest explanation works best. And it turns out there's some other evidence that the ocean is moving. So has anyone been to Hawaii? So Hawaii is awesome. Oh, I see one thumbs up. Hawaii is awesome. 2 thumbs up, cool. Okay, less. So Hawaii is awesome, but it's also in the middle of the stinking ocean. It is way smack in the middle of the Pacific. If we go back to this other slide, whoops, we go backwards. So the Pacific Ocean's really big. We can see the edges of the continents. We can see the mid-ocean ridge, and Hawaii is way the heck over here. It's in the middle of nothing. It's in the middle of some really old ocean. Oh yeah, I see an unfortunately not. Once the pandemic is over, you should go to Hawaii. My guess is flights will be cheap. But don't go now because they've got it under control because they're an island. No one goes there. Yeah, Hawaii is in the middle of nowhere. It's in the middle of some of this pretty old rock. And that is weird. And so the reason that Hawaii exists is actually something called a hot spot. And so a hot spot is basically, remember how I talked about, for the most part, the rock in the mantle or in the asthenosphere, in the mesosphere, is not liquid. Well, a hot spot is a case where it's so unusually hot that the heat overcomes the pressure and it does become a liquid. So you can kind of think of a hot spot as like a blowtorch coming up from the core that is so hot that it burns all the way through the crust or through the lithosphere. And so in that case, like if you had this flamethrower or this blowtorch, and it was just staying still, you might imagine, like, let's say you had a piece of paper with your I don't know, maybe this doesn't make sense. But just imagine that you have, let's say you have a super hot thing and something is on top of it, and that thing isn't moving. What might you expect to see over that hot spot?
That it would start to break at the spot.
Yeah, so you would definitely see not so, I mean, breaking is part of it, but also, let's say that molten rock is coming out of that hotspot. What might you expect to see coming out of that break?
Magma or lava.
Yeah, you would start to see a whole lot of lava. But if the plate isn't moving, or if the hotspot isn't moving, what would you expect that eventually to look like?
Volcano.
Yeah, like one really big volcano, right? But Hawaii is not just one really big volcano. Hawaii has a ton of volcanoes on a whole bunch of islands. And so, actually, so the Big Island is just the most recently active one. But there's a bunch of islands in the Hawaiian chain. And then actually, if you keep looking underwater, there are remnants of other islands that used to be above the water and now there aren't. And then if you keep going, there's actually an almost right angle turn, and you get into the Emperor's Seamounts, which are seamount, an underwater mountain. And also, if you keep looking at them, the rocks in the Big Island of Hawaii are the youngest. And as you keep going back and going back and going back to the Emperor's Seamounts, over here at the other end of this line, of this bent line, they're the oldest. And so this is forming now, this formed a long time ago. But the fact that it's not just one spot, the fact that it's a big line means that something moved. And so you could say, okay, what if the hotspot moved? What if the hotspot started up here and went this way? But when you think about the fact that everything else is moving, when you have that mid-ocean ridge that moved, when you have the continents that look like they used to fit together and now they don't, doesn't it make more sense then that the plate moved over the hotspot, which is staying still, rather than the hotspot moving under a plate that is staying still? So it's another piece of the story. And another thing about this that's actually extra cool is the fact that this is a bent line rather than a straight line means that at one point this changed directions. So it's not just that things were always going in one direction. It means at one point something was moving this way and started moving more this way. And there is a story to that. And we're actually, maybe we'll touch on it less. We touch on this story less than in my class about California, because even though this is far from California, it's kind of related to some stuff that happened in California right around here. But I digress. If that's something you're interested in, we can talk about it later. But does this idea of this hotspot kind of blasting a hole through it as the plate moves, does that make sense? So Hawaii is still a hotspot. Actually, Iceland also has a hotspot. Iceland is a hotspot under a mid-ocean ridge. So Iceland is wacky, but I digress. I just want to talk about Iceland because it's cool. Next class. So they found this. And there's another thing, even more pieces to the puzzle. So remember how last time I said that the Earth is a magnet? And that sometimes that magnetic field switches which way is north and which way is south? No one knows why that happens. People are still trying to figure out why that happens. But it does. And as it happens, rocks that have metal in them, as those rocks are either cooling or hardening, especially cooling. So most of the rock that has a lot of metal in it is volcanic rock, like the volcanic rock that comes out of a mid-ocean ridge. That rock is very metallic. And so as that rock is cooling, all of those little grains of metal in it are going to behave like itty-bitty magnets. Kind of like, like how an Etch-a-Sketch, when you drag the magnet along the Etch-a-Sketch, the little metal shavings in there line up with the pen. This is the same kind of idea where as that volcanic rock is cooling, all of the metal in it kind of goes shoot to line up with whichever way the magnetic field is facing of the Earth at the time. And that turns out to be another really easily observable thing when you happen to be looking for enemy submarines that might be trying to kill you. So I step back though. The idea of using the orientation of the magnetic field to understand things about the rock is a thing called paleomagnetism. So remember how last time I said is like, if you can have some rocks where the metal is oriented one way, and then if the magnetic field flips, the rocks next to it might have the metal pointing the other way. That's kind of basically using that principle to understand what rocks formed where and when is called paleomagnetism. So that prefix paleo just means old. So you probably have heard of paleontology, which is the study of fossils or of dead life. So the ontology means life or classification of life. The paleo refers to old. So you'll see that word paleo in a lot of things. So like paleoseismology is learning about old earthquakes. Paleomagnetism is the study of how the magnetic field of the earth used to be, or using what we know about the magnetic field of the earth to tell us about what has to have happened. So paleomagnetism really came into its own. I mean, people were using it to some degree for rocks on land, but it really came into its own in like the 1960s during the Cold War. And so during the Cold War, again, the US was very concerned about Russia sending submarines to do bad things to us. And I guess Russia was probably worried about that too, but about the US doing bad things to them. But definitely there was a lot of like trying to look for submarines and other things in the ocean coming for us. And so since those things were made of metal, basically they sent out a lot of ships and a lot of equipment to scan the ocean floor for metal, to look for magnetic things moving through the ocean. And I'm not a historian, I don't know how many magnetic things moving through the ocean they found, but what they did find is that the ocean floor itself is very magnetic, which makes sense, the rocks there have a lot of iron in them. But also that the magnetism on the floor of the ocean has stripes. So this is an example from off the Pacific Northwest. This is the Juan de Fuca Ridge. So this is a small mid-ocean ridge. And basically, as people were scanning this area for submarines, what they found was stripes. And so this is the pattern of stripes that they found. Also, I need to step aside and say, I did not make this figure. I did not put Comic Sans on this figure. Comic Sans is not appropriate for scientific figures, but this is otherwise a good figure. We can blame these folks for that. But anyway, looking at how symmetrical this is, right? So do you see how there's a line of symmetry in this pattern of stripes? Like, can you see how, if I draw that, the stuff to the left and the stuff to the right look basically the same as each other? Just opposite. So these people looking for submarines, again, I have no idea how many submarines they did or didn't find, but they found this and went, huh. But by the 60s, people were really like, the 60s is when people were really starting to put the pieces of the puzzle together. All of these other pieces of evidence were collected through kind of the first half of the 20th century. But with this observation in the 60s, there's sort of two major sets of observations in the 60s were what really made it finally come together. And this is one of them, saying, yeah, this volcanic rock is coming out of the mid-ocean ridges and is cooling in, and it's symmetrical. So if you think of the mid-ocean ridge as kind of a conveyor belt, where a asthenosphere, or where molten rock is coming up out of here, and as it hardens, it hardens, and then more of it comes out and pushes it out of the way. So this isn't just like a leak coming up through a single little conduit. It's this whole gap. And so this movement isn't just like piling it up and piling up, it's pushing. And so in this example, these stripes are of different ages. So like you can see here, this is the same as this is the same as this, and so on. So everywhere that it says, each of these numbers correlate with the number on the other side. But within these increments of millions of years, we can see several cases where the magnetic pole has flipped. Sometimes it goes almost a million years without flipping. Sometimes it flips, every 100,000 or even 10,000 years. But by seeing this pattern is exactly the same. And not only is the pattern the same, but the ages correlate. You go, yeah, the stuff over here is the same age as the stuff over here. And it also happens to be the same pattern of stripes. They realized, yeah, this is working like a conveyor belt. Like, let's say the mid-ocean ridge is putting stuff on the conveyor belt and it's moving away at equal speed. And so new rock comes out and moves away. New rock comes out and moves away. Over and over and over, steady pace throughout time. And so that's where we're getting new rock. That's where oceans form. This crack that started between continents, eventually so much rock came out of it that it dropped down low enough and water came in there and it became an ocean. And we see that it matches in age, that it matches in shape, that it matches in magnetism. The ocean has this symmetry to it, just like on the continents, there's the same stuff on either side. So does that make sense? And so in this case, now we have this mechanism for how the oceans are forming and getting bigger. Stuff is coming out, pushing things out of the way. So we know where that's coming from. We see why the seafloor is spreading. We see why the continents are drifting, because they're getting pushed by this. But the Earth is not getting bigger. Now, there are some people that have conspiracy theories that the Earth is actually expanding, but they're wrong. It is a conspiracy theory. There are all sorts of conspiracy theories. And every piece of evidence suggests that the Earth, this stuff has to go somewhere. It's not, there's no evidence that says the ocean has gotten bigger, the Earth has gotten bigger. Nor does that make sense, because if you were going to be just generating seafloor forever, I mean, that's stuff coming out of the inside of the Earth, right? And so if you take everything out of the inside of the Earth and nothing new is going into the inside of the Earth, you would just get a cavity. And that doesn't make sense. Gravity would not allow that to happen. You can't have an open space inside the Earth. For everything that comes out, something else is going to have to fill back in, just from a physics standpoint. And so the question came up of, okay, we know where the new rock is coming from. Where is the old rock going? And it turned out there were a lot of pieces of evidence for that. So one thing is just the location of volcanoes around the world. So if we remember, our mid-ocean ridges are in the middle of the ocean, right? Actually, there are not a whole lot of volcanoes on the edges of the Atlantic, but in the Pacific, the ridge is kind of here. So if the ridge is in the middle of the Pacific, where are the volcanoes? Yeah, so I see someone saying Ring of Fire. So that's absolutely right, Mario. So who all has heard of the Ring of Fire? See a lot of raised hands and nodding. So what is that? What is the Ring of Fire? Whoever wants to try and answer that.
I don't know if this is necessarily correct, but from my understanding, the Ring of Fire is along the sort of borders of the Pacific Ocean. That it's surrounded by volcanoes, so you can see, especially on the map, that the outline of the Pacific Ocean is just covered in volcanoes.
Yeah.
So I don't necessarily know why.
We're about to talk about why. But yeah, that is exactly right. And everyone, Brianna and Osman and Miguel, everyone who said that, Johnny Cash, that's fair. That's fair. I'm pretty sure he wasn't thinking about plate tectonics. But yeah, the volcanoes, that's absolutely right. Yes, there are lots of geology parodies of Johnny Cash's Ring of Fire. Just look on YouTube, there are more than one. But yeah, so all the volcanoes are on the edges in the Ring of Fire. But the mid-ocean ridge, which we've established is also a volcano, is in the middle. So if all of the new rock is coming out of the mid-ocean ridge and pushing towards the edges of the continents, and obviously volcanoes mean something's going on. Volcanoes are definitely something is going on. Wouldn't it stand to reason that maybe the volcanoes are involved in wherever that other rock is going? So it turns out that they're not where the rock is going, but they are a symptom of where the rock is going. The other piece of evidence is where you have volcanoes, you always have earthquakes. So what do you notice about the position of these earthquakes compared to the volcanoes? Yeah, very similar. Exactly right. So there are places that have earthquakes that don't have volcanoes, but all of the places that have volcanoes also have earthquakes. And so in order to get an earthquake, you need to have rock scraping past other rock. So we'll talk a lot more about that at the very end of the semester. But basically, earthquakes happen when large amounts of rock shove past each other. And they can happen at different depths in the earth. And so the color coding on this map, blue means they're pretty shallow. So you see a lot of earthquakes at the mid-ocean ridge because they're volcano, but it's shallow. Then green means they're a little deeper, and red means they're even deeper. And so notice, like, under South America, and also under like New Zealand, under Japan. Let's focus on South America just because South America is a less messy situation. Like Southeast Asia all of this is a very, very messy place tectonically. But notice, on the coast of South America, the earthquakes are shallow. And then as you go further in, they get deeper. And as you go even further in, they get deeper. And so when you get pretty far inland, you're still having earthquakes, but they're much further under the earth as compared to the ones that are at the coast that are really shallow. And so what does that say about the depth of where rock has to be scraping past itself? Is all of this rock scraping happening at the same depth? Yeah, no, it is not. That is correct. And so in order for the scraping to be happening deeper, something has to be down there, right? Something has to be under that continent. And it turns out that the thing that's under the continent is the old plate. So if we look at this from a cross section, the earthquakes and the volcanoes line up even more. And it kind of makes sense with the oldest ocean rock being at the edges. So what this is evidence of is a process called subduction, where the old seafloor is shoving under either newer seafloor or under a continent. So this example says Japan, but this is true for every subduction zone. And so, so if you think about one plate sinks under the other, we'll talk more about why that happens next class. At the top, it's shallow, so all of the earthquakes happen where it's really shallow. But as that goes further and further inland, or further and further towards the continent, this plate is down there deeper and deeper and deeper, and so the earthquakes are happening deeper and deeper. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
And so the reason that you get volcanoes above subduction zones is actually this pulls a certain amount of water in there, which helps rock melt. We'll talk a lot more about that in a few weeks when we talk about volcanoes. But basically, in order for you to have a volcano, you need to have something that makes this rock melt, even though the pressure conditions and temperature conditions normally wouldn't allow it to melt. So that water, which can only come in by a plate dragging it in from the ocean, helps this melt. And it also means you have some rock down there to do some scraping and cause earthquakes. And so this was an idea people looked at from just looking at data. But then in 1964, there was a really big earthquake in Alaska. There was a magnitude 9.2 earthquake in Alaska. And by the 1960s, there was a lot of really good observation on like a lot of seismometers, a lot of ways to observe earthquakes and figure out what happened. And they were able to tell that that Alaska earthquake happened on something that looked like this, that happened on an interface that was shoving under. And they were able to tell that the way the land deformed in Alaska above the place that had the earthquake could only happen by something pushing under. And so really, again, the 60s was kind of the breaking point. The 60s is when they discovered the magnetic stripes in the ocean and when they discovered the process of subduction, the process of old seafloor, of one plate shoving under another plate. And so now you have the mechanism. By spreading in a mid-ocean ridge, you're forming new rock. And by subduction, that older rock is going back inside the earth to be recycled again. And so in that case, you can have continents spreading apart if the mid-ocean ridge is moving very quickly and that conveyor belt is going fast. Or you can also have continents come together if the subduction process is faster than the spreading process and the old rock gets consumed faster than the new rock is formed. So in that way, you can have continents coming together like Pangaea. So Pangaea formed by a whole lot of subduction, bringing everything together until it crashed together. And then Pangaea spread back apart when the process reversed and things started splitting apart. And the mid-ocean spreading was happening faster than the subduction. And now we know that this has happened over and over. Pangaea was just the most recent one. And it'll happen again. But does this make sense? So yeah, the paper that really first solidified the theory of plate tectonics was published in the late.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so sorry, was that an agreement or a question?
It's an agreement.
Okay. So in the late 1960s, this was published, and it really was a paradigm shift. It really was this simple idea that the lithosphere is broken up into plates, and they are moving and interacting. That this stuff forms at the end, in the middle of the ocean, and dies at the edges of continents. This simple thing, it's really, there's only a few parts to it, and explains so much about why the ocean is the way it is, why earthquakes happen the way they do, why volcanoes happen where they happen, why certain fossils are in certain places, why certain glacial striations are in certain places, why certain rocks that are really far apart match up. You could come up with an individual explanation for all of them, but this single, like a separate explanation for all of them, but this single explanation explains everything in a few very simple terms. Now, if you wanted to go into studying tectonics, there's a lot of very complex things that you can do. But this overall theory, it is the framework for modern geology. Now, it still took some time for it to be widely accepted, and there are even still some sort of older people, most of them are retired now, who don't like this. I think they're mostly retired. But it definitely took a couple of decades before people really started to believe it. And especially a lot of the real paradigm shift came when the old school people retired, which is unfortunately the way a lot of paradigm shifts happen, not just in science. But now this is just widely accepted and really is the framework around which geology is taught. I mean, and I'm definitely going to be framing everything around this. But it's also the framework of just interpreting everything. You really, in order to understand how a landscape formed, why a certain rock is the way it is and where it is, it all ties back into this. And so that's why we're doing this at the beginning of the class. This is the physics of how the Earth works. And it is just really, really central. And so the next question is why does it do that? And for that, that is actually where we're gonna start next time. So does anyone have any questions about anything? Confusion, curiosity, just something, anything?
I had a question, and it's on topic, but it's not about the Earth.
Okay.
It's mainly about, so I had heard that Mars doesn't have, or its core has cooled, which led to it not having a magnetic field. How does that happen? Just like in like, or unless you like, if you don't know.
So yeah, so remember how I said that the Earth's magnetic field comes from the boiling outer core?
Yeah.
So if the metal in Mars's core isn't hot enough to do that, if it's not hot enough to boil, it's not going to generate a magnetic field. And so if Mars cooled enough that you don't have that boiling inner core anymore, you're not going to have a magnetic field.
But I guess my main question would be like, how would it like cool? Because that implies like it was once boiling and then over time cooled. Or am I wrong on that?
Yeah, so everything is cooling. The Earth has actually cooled as well. Everything is cooling compared to when the Big Bang happened. But Mars is, well, it's smaller, so there's less of it to cool. It's further from the sun, so it's not being warmed in that way. Also, it does have a somewhat different chemical composition from Earth, so it's going to cool at a different rate.
Okay, got it.
Every
Thank
body
you.
in the universe is different. But there is evidence that Mars used to have plate tectonics. There are big volcanoes. There are things that look like rifts and collision zones on Mars. And absolutely, planetary geology is very much a real field. There are some places that are super way different from Earth, but there are some places that have a lot in common. So even if you come out of this class going, I'm kind of tired of Earth, there's a lot of solar system, there's a lot of universe out there.
Thank you so much.
Any other questions?
No, sir.
Yeah. Oh, no, sir.
No.
Okay, then in that case, that's it for today. Please don't, I'm gonna post the next quick quiz right after this. Slides are not gonna go up until after our next plate tectonics lecture because it's a whole topic. But the slides for last lecture, all the other ones are up. And with that said, do not forget, we do not have class on Monday because there's a holiday. Also, please be safe this weekend. It is supposed to be 115 degrees in Northridge on Saturday. I don't know where all of you are, but please avoid going outside, drink a lot of water, take care of yourselves. I guess I will see you on Wednesday. I have office hours Tuesday if you want to come to those. And I'll hang out in here for a few more minutes if anyone has any other questions. But if not, I will see you next time.
Have a good day.
Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, the noise finally stopped. Cool.
Quick question, Professor. I still don't have my book.
Just let me know when you get it. How long ago did you order it?
It's been like a week already now. I know.
So I'm sure you're aware that the postal service is kind of a total disaster right now. So
Yeah.
it's probably going to be a little bit slow. Did they give you a tracking number?
Yeah, I was gonna start like figuring that out and calling and see if something.
That and I guess just keep me posted. I'll reopen all those vocab things for you once you get the book. But if it looks like it's going to be a really long time, we can try and figure something out.
Okay, sounds good.
No
Thank
problem.
you, Professor.
Thank you. Have a good weekend.
You
I guess
too.
it's only Wednesday. Have a good weekend.